I'm going to go ahead and get it going. Like Leanne said, I'm the only thing, well, I mean, I'm not the only thing keeping you here, but I'm assuming you wanted to learn, and until I'm done, the learning won't be over. But, I appreciate the opportunity to come down. This is, September has been the month of Central and West Texas for me. I've been bouncing around from Uvalde all the way up here to Kerrville to Alpine, and it's been a really good time to get back to a very pretty part of the state, to be real honest. So yeah, I'm the small acreage program specialist for extension.
Can you define small acreage?
Yes, I can. That is probably, believe it or not, that is actually one of the questions I get asked most often. That's, you can imagine. So I will tell you right now, when I say small acreage and how that is defined, I'm going to give you the extension answer. It depends, right? So it's the only right answer, but like my professors used to tell me, you can't use it on the test. But my job description says that a small acreage property is 100 acres or less, right? If you go to the USDA's website and you look at what defines a small farm or ranch, they don't define it by acres, they define it by income, right? What I tend to say is that what is considered small acreage is relevant to your local context. If you are right outside, if you are adjacent to Fredericksburg and you've got 25 acres, you probably have, a decent sized bit of property. If you're outside of Fort Stockton and you've got less than a section, 640 acres, you've got small acreage, right? It is all about that context. And the practical definition, the one that's probably the most useful for what actually answering you, I define small acreage as the point at which our traditional and contemporary practices stop translating into the reality of management, right? At what point do the things that we recommend stop kind of working, right? If you have a 200-acre hay meadow, you're doing some of those weed treatments that were just discussed. Yeah, you can hit that sucker with a 60-foot boom sprayer and take care of it, and it's probably not a big deal. But if you've got 5 acres, that's maybe 2 passes. But you're not going to find someone with a 60-foot boom sprayer that wants to deal with driving to your property and spending more time setting up than tackling that. And then the other relevant question is that still the best way to address that problem? Right? So a lot of what I do, and you are about to learn this, congratulations, you are entering a conservation philosophy talk, right? Because as Leanne said, I cover half the state of Texas, usually everything north of Austin. I made the mistake of counting that one day, it's like 187 counties, and I split it with Liz Tidwell in Uvalde. She is on maternity leave, so I get to cover the whole state, and then when I'm on parental leave in December, she'll cover the whole state as well. But and a big part of that, the reason I like to specifically mention this is because I like to take about the 10,000 foot view, right? All the talks you've had up to this point have been very focused, very detailed. We're looking at watersheds, we're looking at specific plants, specific weeds, specific practices. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking this up. We're going to take this broad look at what are some of the common threads and these foundational understandings that help us tie all these perspectives, all these recommendations together into good management, right? And like I said, I cover the whole state. If I do not have the specific local knowledge to tell you exactly what your stocking rate should be, what your carrying capacity is, exactly what all the minutia of the flora and fauna that only appear in Kerr County, etc. Right? You have experts for that. You have county extension agents. You've got your NRCS office. You've got Parks and Wildlife College. You've got people who can tell you those very specific practices. So instead, I want you to come away from my talk thinking about how do we do things, why do we do them the way we do them, and where do you go to get those answers, right? How do we compare these options that are there? So, I was told in grad school once that a good educator has learning objectives. So I have learning objectives up here, and I think that means I'm a good educator then. I don't know, I took logic instead of Cal 2 in college, so. But in any case, so today, what we are going to discuss very broadly is 3 points. First, we're going to talk about the land use history of Texas. right? Why does Texas look the way it does now? How is that different than it used to? And what do those trends mean moving forward and for you as landowners or land managers? All right. Second, we're going to talk about how to basically look at your land, look at that property you own, that you manage, etc., and what I like to call calibrating your eyeballs. Right? How do you look at a piece of land and start to identify what are the opportunities, what are the limitations, what can you do or can't you do with a specific parcel, right? And then the last bit is I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we look at the different practices we have available and compare and contrast them to figure out what actually fits what we want to do. All right? So with that, why do we manage land, right? We manage land because we want to do something with it, right? And all land management is doing something with your land. I mean, look, I'm an Aggie. You're going to find out nothing I talk about is rocket surgery here, all right? Like, none of this is going to individually be just mind-blowing, but I think it's important that we revisit it, right? Because land management at its core are the things we do to a property, to the land we manage, to the land we own, to your yard, your garden, whatever it is, they are actions we take or choose not to take that impact and take us along to a goal we set. All right? And one thing to note, and I was very particular about how I phrase this, not doing anything is an active choice and a land management choice. The act of doing nothing does not mean that things will stay the same. Nature is always going to progress and change no matter what we do or we do not do. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but it's one of the things I always like to emphasize is that, the decisions we make impact that land, but that land is going to be changing no matter what we do. I can hold on for a second, don't worry. All right, so context, right? This is where we set the context for land in Texas, right? Drought, fire, bison. These are the three things that shaped the state of Texas and the ecology of Texas in the past, in the historical past. And we're going to talk about how those three things have changed and what that means for what we see today, right? Because when we look back at Texas, what the state of Texas, obviously it wasn't the state of Texas then, but the land we see now is dramatically and drastically different than what it was before the 1900s, before Spanish colonization, before we had invasive species like horses and cows that were let loose upon the property, upon the land, right? And these changes over the last 500-600 years, accelerating in the last 100, or so years, have dramatically changed what we see on the state, right? And one of the things to also consider is that when we talk about these three major drivers, all of our plants and all our native plants and native wildlife evolved and adapted under those conditions of 400 to 700 years ago, right? So they are in a different context now, but the conditions upon which they grew and their biology adapted are those of the historical past, right? So first things, drought. Texas is a state of drought that sometimes rains. All right, and this is again. There's a reason I have three main concepts, right? So when we look at the state of Texas, this graph is all the recorded precipitation data we have going back to 1895 for the state of Texas on an annual rainfall basis. So 1895 here to 2023. Don't have 2024 yet because we haven't finished the year up. And if we look at that graph, we can see a couple things. So the green line, that's how much rain we got every year. They talked about periods like the 1950s where it was a severe persistent drought. You have years like 2011, 2022. Now, I want you to also look at what's this gray line right here, that's our average rainfall, right? How many years are you seeing that are average? Since 1895, how many years can we say are truly average in the state of Texas? And what is the proportion of years that are above that versus below it? Right? We are a state of drought that sometimes gets rain. Now, we're gonna dial this in a little bit. This is Kerr County, all right? So Kerr County, Texas, same time frame, right? Now we're gonna look at this blue line. So the change in average rainfall from 1895 to 2023, we have lost 3/100 of an inch on over the course of that time period. All right? And we get an average of 28.3 inches of rain per year in Kerr County. Again, how many of these are above that line? You look at the red line, that's a running 5-year average. Again, how many years are below that red line versus above it, right? And this is one of those times where I'm metaphorically slamming this pulpit, because we need to understand that if we are managing land in Texas, we do not manage for rain. We manage for drought. We get a drought every year in the summer. It sometimes rains in the winter and spring. Sometimes we get multiple years of even worse drought. But if we want to have sustainable and we want to have constructive land management, we need to plan on it to be dry. And if we get rain, we are happy as we can, right? We are excited that we get rain. Because if we plan on rain and then we don't get it, that's when we're up a creek. That's when you're having to sell cows you didn't think you'd have to. That's when you're facing serious unexpected economic losses, right? And so manage for the dry, praise when it's wet. And then we look at the state of Texas, right? So that was drought. Now we look at what was this landscape like? Here's a map of all the major ecoregions in Texas. There's a lot of very small print. But one of the things to understand is when we look at the different ecologies of Texas, very few of them are not predominantly grass and rangeland, right? Texas, as we see it today, we're going to talk about all these dang trees, all right? But these ecosystems, all right, everyone knows, okay, panhandle's grass. Hey, you go out here, that's a rangeland too. It only gets 10 inches of rain a year, but you still get grass growing. You have South Texas plains, Central Texas prairies, right? Even the cross timbers, which was up here towards the Metroplex. If you read the original accounts of settlers coming in and they talk about the cross timbers, that was a band about 60 miles wide of impenetrable oak forest. It was only 60 miles wide. Now it goes from Fort Worth all the way up past Palo Pinto. You can read the original accounts of settlers driving covered wagons through the longleaf pine prairies of northeast Texas. How far are you going to get today if you try to drive a wagon through it, right? So, we have these systems predominantly driven by fire that maintained an ecosystem where you had brush, right? Juniper trees, cedar trees are native, right? They're a native plant. And they tended to be where the fire would go. We got lots of rocky hilltops here in the hill country. Where do you see a lot of cedar trees? In these rocky hilltops. Why? Because there isn't enough grass to move fire into it. Same thing down in the creek bottoms. And what we've seen is all those middle spaces are the ones that are filling in. That's where you're seeing these areas that used to be grass converting to brush. And you can also take a look. This is a map of some very smart people in Arizona and across the country discovered, everyone knows that trees have rings, and a lot of trees, you can count the number of rings, and that's how old the tree is. Well, there's also, those tree rings whenever a fire comes through, gets a little burn scar, right? Turns black. They discovered, okay, well, if we know how old the tree is, and we have all these little black marks where a fire came through, well, suddenly you can start figuring out how many fires came through on average. And so when we look at the natural history of the United States, they realized you can calculate how often fires came through. And in Texas, using my Aggie color matching skills, you can see in a lot of the state, we had fires that burned through the state about every other year, right? And when you look, so let's look, and when you look here, okay, the areas that got a lot of fire are the areas that were a lot of prairies, right? You had a little bit less over here in some of the forests, and obviously less over here, which just doesn't rain enough to have enough to grow enough grass for it to burn. But these are the systems of fire that maintained a historically grass-dominated ecosystem, right? And as Zach talked about, these grasses and the plants, we have adapted to that. How many of y'all have ever been on a fire or come in after a fire in Texas? How long did it take for you to start seeing green growing up in the burned area? Exactly. These grasses, they know that they're used to it burning. Most of that plant is not above ground, it's below ground, right? And so when it burns off the top, yeah, a couple days later you'll start seeing shoots come up. You also see it on mesquite trees too, but we don't like to talk about that. I promised Leanne I wasn't going to cuss very much in this talk, so we don't need to talk about mesquites. But yeah, so and then the third part of this is bison, right? Bison range all across the Great Plains, and that's from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. All right, and bison, again, this is going to shock you. Bison are not cows. All right, they graze differently. The proportion of what they eat is different, and then the actual patterns upon which they consume grass and forage is different than cattle. Cattle graze more intensely over smaller areas. Bison tend, as you can imagine, when you have the whole Great Plains, you could just keep walking and eating. You didn't have to eat everything in a spot and then move on and eat everything in a spot. You could just keep on grazing on your merry way, right? And as bison would go through, it's not just the grazing component, but it was the hoof action, right? Large animals and hoofs create areas where they turn up the soil, expose soil surface, which can then improve seed germination, things like that. They also wallow, right? And so they create these depressions in the ground that can create microclimates that allow for rainfall accumulation and increased biodiversity that way, things like that, right? So that changed, right? There's a lot of history to unpack, and this is a lightning round, but basically one of the first things that happened, that started disrupting this cycle was when the Spaniards came, and they didn't just, show up on their own. They brought things that the Spaniards and European, settled colonizers usually did. They brought horses, they brought cattle, they brought pigs, and oftentimes they would be turned loose. They would either get loose, they might have loose herds that were let out. And so you had these invasive species that were introduced, and the introduction of these herds started the dramatic changing of some of our vegetation systems, right? You now have more ruminant grazers than just the bison that graze, they graze differently. We see in the 1800s the eradication of the bison population, right? We also then have things like barbed wire. Why does barbed wire matter? Because you take these animals, you could have herds of hundreds of thousands of head of cow, but if they have the whole Great Plains, they kind of move. Well, we started fencing them, right? Once we start fencing them, well, suddenly you've got a lot less space, and depending on how many mouths you got to feed, you start running into more frequent issues of overutilization, right? Overgrazing. Then in the 1850s, we have this thing called a windmill that was invented. Wasn't invented for farming, it was invented for the Transcontinental Railroad so that they could have water for the steam engines going west. Then it turned out that, oh wow, this is great, we can access water and use it to farm. All right, another landscape change. And none of these are casting judgments per se on the process so much as just recognizing that these are the different components of change, right? And then in the 1900s we have the era of fire suppression. The city of Chicago almost gets burned down, or it does partially get burned down by wildfires, and the federal government decides that fires are bad, we don't want them, we will not have them. And that began the era where we lost the culture of fire in the United States. A culture that was indigenous, but it was also one that was used by, settlers, right? We had, folks moving into Texas in the 17, 18, 1900s recognized that fire is an effective tool, right? If you are trying to graze cattle, fire is a great and cheap way to keep those pesky woody plants from taking over and reducing the amount of grass you have to graze, right? And so it's just, again, kind of a little history lesson, but it's important to understand that what we see today is not what Texas looked like 50 years ago. It's not what it looked like 100 years ago or even 200 years ago, right? And as a result, one of the things I found, I've been working with small acreage, new landowners a lot, right? Pretty much my entire career in extension, that's the group I've worked in. And sometimes when we move onto a property, or we purchase a property, without this kind of context, what we see tends to be what we manage towards, right? And I'm not saying that that's bad. If you want a cedar thicket, it is in the great state of Texas, you manage your land however you dang well please, right? I don't work for the part of the government that gets to tell you what to do. That's why people tend to pick up the phone when I call that thing. But, so when we try to bring in this context, it allows us to make better educated decisions based on our goals, right? If our goal, use my family ranch for example. We want to restore a lot of our property. We have about 500 acres. We want to restore it back to native rangeland and a historical, kind of landscape arrangement, right? If I didn't know what that historical landscape looked like, how do I know what to manage towards? How do I know what is good, what is bad, what is beneficial, what is not, right? That would be different than if my goal was to try to replace my income so I could be a full-time cattle puncher or cattle rancher, right? And so those goals and the way we execute them rely a lot on our understanding of the context of our property and what that means for the way we're trying to manage. Let's see, and probably chief among these issues is what we call afforestation. It is the opposite of deforestation. We have trees coming in where they do not belong, and they are actively reducing the resiliency, the diversity, and the productivity of our land in Texas, right? By and large, this is due to the removal of fire, but also significantly, fewer people running goats and sheep in the state of Texas, right? Goats eat a prodigious amount of brush. When we don't have goats, you lose one other method of suppression. Why is afforestation a bad thing? Like I said, how many of y'all have pushed your way through a cedar thicket, have that particular joy, right? How many different species of plants do you see underneath a cedar thicket? Yeah, probably, I would say maybe 4. I mean, obviously you have the cedar trees, right? They do count, they are plants. Maybe you have greenbrier, that's always kind of fun, you get stuck in that a little bit. If you're in a creek bottom, you get some poison ivy for a little bit of fun, right? And then we have, I think, all of 2 grasses in the state of Texas that thrive in shade, right? So and again, take a step back. I think those 2 grasses are inland sea oaks, and I think it's either Canada or Virginia wild rye, I can't remember which, doesn't matter. But, so think of the whole state of Texas. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of different kinds of grasses, and there are all sorts of species and diversity and inclusion across the whole state, and how many of them like to grow in shade? 2. What does that tell you about how Texas used to look? If we had a lot of shade all the time, how many different grass species would you have expected to adapt, right? Again, this is where I get to be the crazy guy, and there's this big map with all these pegs and red yarn connected them all, and I get to be like, look guys, there's a pattern, right? So, but it's all connected. And one of the big things too is as more open areas get encroached with brush and woody plants, the more expensive it is to remediate. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But just the further along this process goes, the more expensive it is in terms of time, money, and effort to bring it back to a historical or healthy ecosystem. Again, just to illustrate this point, this is from 1984 to 2019. So call it 30-ish years. I don't know math. Why 1984? Because that is when we had some of the first commercial satellite imagery available for the globe, right? And we could take the satellite imagery and look at that imagery and actually calculate what is the percentage of woody plants, how many trees were there in Texas in 1984, right? The more red, the more trees. So over here, yeah, so we got a lot of trees in East Texas. Duh. And then we look at 2019, right? I heard someone say, "Where's Mexico?" Oh, look at New Mexico. Yeah, right? I mean, but it's not just Texas, it's all across the Great Plains. And so in 30 years, we've even seen this woody plant encroachment and afforestation is the #1 threat to rangelands and prairie ecosystems in the Great Plains. All right? I don't have the slides on here, but when we look at things like the Blackland Prairie, right along in this part of the state, we have less than 1% of remaining Blackland Prairie, right? Our grasslands and our native grasslands and rangelands are more threatened and lose more square mileage annually than the Brazilian rainforest. And it is more diverse than the Brazilian rainforest.
Isn't some of that lost to development?
To everything, right? To development, to farming, to ranching, conversion to other uses, building lakes on it, kind of all the different things that land can be used for, right? And but that also includes conversion. If you just had a piece of virgin Blackland Prairie and did nothing to it and it became a cedar thicket, that is a conversion out from a Blackland Prairie, right? Good question though. So, why, and again, we have to consider all these species, and especially when we look at wildlife and native plants, what kind of environment are they adapted to? Are they adapted to this open area, this complex system of open grass-dominated areas and patchy wooded spots? Or did they develop in a thicket, right? That's bobwhite quail, that's dove, all these different species we like and love. So, with that pep talk, now we get to talk. So that was Texas as a whole, from eternity in the past to today. So now, this is where we get to dial it in a little bit more, right? So we're going to talk about your property. Because again, as a landowner, you have an incredible opportunity to shape that land to what you want it to do, right? And that's based on your goals, probably your spouse's goals, because I can promise you what I want to do with our ranch is going to be different than what my wife wants, and it behooves me to take that into consideration because I like being married and I like my wife, and I want her to go out there. But, we have to understand, again, so that was the past. Now we're looking at that land today, and we're trying to figure out what we want to do, how do we want to do it. And I will be the first to tell you that if you don't like the way something is turning out, you are welcome to change your mind. If you are bulldozing brush and you decide you don't like the way that's looking or acting or whatever else, you can try a different method. But it all really starts with your inventory, right? What is on your property? Because there are some parts of our land, I will tell you, this is where I get to say an extension, about 5 to 10% of my job is dashing people's hopes and dreams, right? If you are in Kerrville, Texas, I do not care how much money you have, I do not care how much effort you put into it, you are not growing a commercial banana orchard in Kerrville. You're not. The climate won't, we don't have the right climate, we don't have the right soils, it's not gonna happen, right? And that's, and the sooner, and if that was my #1 hope and dream in life, I'd rather find out now than after I spent $40,000 trying to grow bananas, right? And so, when we look at this property, when we look at our land, okay, what is this arrangement? What kind of soils do we have? What kind of vegetation do we have? What kind of fences do we have? Do we have water? What's the slope? All these different things are what allow us to start filtering out, okay, if I want to graze cattle and I own a cedar thicket, can I put cows on it right now? You could. You'll feed a lot of hay, very hungry and sad cows. Or do I need to start doing some other work first, right? If my goal is to graze cows, do I need to clear brush before I can put the cows on the property? You know, and again, none of this is particularly like crazy talk, I think, but it behooves us to kind of take that step back first and really start connecting what we want to do with what we have, because then it's going to reduce your frustration a lot, and it's going to help you better plan out how you want to implement things. I don't have time for it today. A lot of what I do is actually operations planning, working with people how to develop goals and the steps to getting to those end goals. Right? Yep. So we already talked about this. You have, every property has limitations. That's just a fact. If you need help assessing some of those, that's where your resources come in. Your county extension office, your USDA service center, your wildlife parks and wildlife biologists, all these different groups are available in your communities and in your county to help you, often at little to no cost, right? So take advantage of them. And so one of the big things too, again, as I said, this is calibrating your eyeball. What are the pinch points? When do we start realizing, okay, how do we realize what is a problem before it's a big problem? How do we start to understand and conceptualize what does good pasture look like? What does bad pasture look like? What does good habitat look like? What does bad habitat look like? I'm using air quotes because that's all relative, right? But generally speaking, the sooner we can recognize issues, the sooner we can fix them and the cheaper it is to fix them, right? The sooner we get to it, the easier it is to fix and the cheaper it is to fix, right? And good management requires good field assessment. If you don't know you have a problem, you cannot fix a problem before it gets big. If you have brush growing all over your fence and you cannot see that fence got broken, then you're not going to find out until you got cows out on the county road. Or maybe your neighbor's cows are on your place. So we're going to start with some pictures. Right? I'm an Aggie, I like pictures. And again, I'm going to ask you some questions. None of these are particularly hard. Look at this fence line. Which side of the fence has more forage? That one, yeah. All right. Which side do you think might have had more cattle on it? Yep. All right. Which one looks more diverse? There you go. See, again, we already know some of this stuff, right? We can look at a picture and be like, okay, the one on the left, it's got more diversity. The one on the right, the grasses are a little bit shorter. You see fewer different kinds of species, etc. And so we already know some of this stuff. And so when we think about, okay, how are we going to consider good or bad, we have an easy spot right here. We're going to look at this next one. How good of a pasture is this? If I was a cow, how much would I like this pasture? If I was a white-tailed deer, how happy would I be? If I was a quail, where would I want to nest? Right? We can all pretty well say, this kind of sucks. But sometimes when we buy property, sometimes we have areas that look like this. And so then the question is, okay, if this is the situation I've got, what is the next step to address it, right? And it all starts with recognizing where these problem areas are. Look at this next one. All right? Now again, if I was a cow, how much of this grass can I access? Some. Is this good forage for a cow? It could be. In a drought, there's a lot about, in Texas, I think it was in Texas, we invented the pear burner, where you can then burn all the spines off that prickly pear. Cows can eat it in a drought. Is it very labor intensive? Yes. Right? But again, maybe, and then again, what about a white-tailed deer or a turkey? They might be a little bit happier in this, right? I'm not saying it's perfect, but what you're using it for and what your goals are determine the suitability of an area. Next one, right? That's pretty good. You got a lot of grass. You got a lot of really good native grass. I think that's a lot of switchgrass. You got all sorts of diversity in there. If I was trying to grow hay, how happy would I be? Right? And so we think when we look at these properties, and one of the things, I mean, I drive a lot for work. I mean, I drove 4 hours here, I'll drive 4 hours home after this. One of the things I do to entertain myself is I just look at land, right? I look at it. You know, especially when I'm in different parts of the state, it helps me understand what normal looks like. I was in Alpine 2 weeks ago. I had a landowner, he was happy as can be. He had 300 pounds of forage per acre.
What?
That is about a parking lot's worth of grass. Yeah, a gravel parking lot's worth of grass. Right? And I actually have a picture of it later on. This is pushing over 2,000 to 3,000 pounds per acre. Right? So again, it's all relative, highly related to how much rain you get. So now we're going to hit this last bit. You know, I've got 13 minutes left according to my watch, and so now we're going to go. We talked about history. We talked about how to look at our land and how to calibrate our eyeballs, and now we're going to talk about how we look at practices. Right? What are some concepts that are good to know, and how do we choose the practices we want to implement? Right? And this is actually from a quote from a book I was reading that actually looked at the original biological survey of Texas from 1893 to 1905 or something like that. But it's just, look, change is a natural part of our environment, right? And it's a factor of which all the components of all our natural communities are adapted to. So change is normal. Your property is used to change, your plants are used to change, your critters are used to change, and nothing is not in a state of change. So let's embrace it. So the principles of restoration and conservation, right? I always like to kind of start with this. And I will also say you will hear a lot of terms. You know, holistic was big a couple years ago. Right now, everyone's all about regenerative. You know, you hear all these terms and all this marketing, and I'm not saying anyone's good or bad. But what I am going to tell you is that regardless of what the label is associated with it, good management is good management. Good practices are good practices, right? And a lot of these different systems, a lot of these different concepts have a lot of parallels to them, right? Because at the end of the day, when we talk about conservation, first and foremost, what are we trying to do? Protect our soil. Then we want to encourage native and beneficial plants. We want to minimize disturbance, and we want to understand our biology, right? You know, because if we don't do these four things, we're working against ourselves just as much as we are for us. You know, and I will say these are guidelines, right? Nothing in here is an absolute must, you know, or if you disturb the soil, you're going to, screw over your property for eternity. No, sometimes you have to, right? Sometimes we have to do things that we know aren't always best practice, but we got to do it to get to the point where we can do the right stuff first. You know, if you have to bulldoze the cedar before you can put in, the native plants or the native prairie grasses, then yeah, it's going to tear up the soil. But sometimes if you want to get it done in a reasonable time frame, you're going to be disturbing soil. And if you know what the impacts of that are, guess what? You can mitigate it. You can plan for it, you can adapt to it, you can overcome it. So first things first, we need to protect the soil, right? So this is actually our family ranch. We burned this pasture here on the right, or my right, your left, in February of 2022. It did not rain for 14 months. So when we look at this, I just started seeing green, substantial green on it, and it just started revegetating this past year when it started raining. But when we look on this left hand of the road, right hand of the road, which of these soil surfaces is more likely to erode? That one. Yeah, good. See, I don't even have to prompt y'all. Y'all are already getting this. And so why does that matter? Because bare soil is soil you're losing. You're losing it to wind. You're losing it to rain, the impact of raindrops, surface water flow. It's reducing the ability of that water to infiltrate into the soil. And you're going to have increased soil temperatures. On the surface, meaning increased soil temperatures below the surface, which means you're losing soil organic carbon and nitrogen to volatilization to the air, which means that you're losing that water holding capacity and nutritive capacity of that soil, right? There you go. That was like half a semester of introduction to soils and why organic matter is important. Why is soil organic matter so important? It's because it is the buffer it is the sponge that adds utility to soils, right? When you have organic matter, you have the ability to retain water better. That organic matter. So when we think about soil nutrients, right? We have organic derived, and that's not organic like the certified organic, it's like organic inorganic. So you have organic nutrients, like let's say fish bone meal, like you see for your yard. On any given year, about 12 to 14% of that is going to be digested by the soil microbiome and turned into a plant available form, right? Soil organic matter, as I put it, is that long-term it's that annuity, right? You're investing in an annuity and it's going to give you gradual payouts year after year. But in the meantime, that's your cushion, right? That soil organic matter, yet it's going to be that slow release nutrients, but it's also going to hold on to water. It's going to improve the utility of your soil. If you have very clayey soils, organic matter makes them a lot more workable. It's going to improve the microbiome. Healthy organic soil, guess what? It has a lot of bacteria, it has a lot of viruses, it has a lot of protozoa and bugs and all sorts of other things in it. And when you have a healthy, diverse ecosystem, you have a lot of resilience there too, right? And you have a lot of those little microbiota that can help convert different organic matter components into nutrients, etc. We can improve soil organic matter in a bunch of different ways. But at the end of the day, soils work best when they're in place and when they have structure. The more we disturb that soil, the less structure we have, right? How many of you see cracks in your soil in the summer sometimes? That's a natural part of it, right? Sometimes the soils dry out. As they dry out, they shrink and you get these cracks going in. What happens when it rains? Water then immediately goes deep in your soil profile, right? Eventually they swell shut. But in the meantime, you suddenly have deep soils getting readily hydrated by that rainfall. And so, and then if you look on the microscopic level, soil forms other structures, right? We have clods. And those clods, obviously there are cracks between them. Again, that's a way for surface water to move vertically through the soil profile. If we did not have that structure, that's when you get ponding, that's when you get, at the soil surface. If that water doesn't have anywhere to go in the soil, it's going to move across it. And when it moves across it, it likes to take souvenirs with it. And that souvenir is your soil, right? When we have vegetation on our soil, guess what? That water is more easily going to move into the soil, but it's also going to slow down that surface water flow. And the slower that water goes, the harder it is to move soil, right? And so we want to slow the soil. The grass and vegetation shades that soil surface, reduces that soil temperature, preserves a lot of the nitrogen and the other volatiles that might have gotten cooked out. Protects it from the wind, protects it from raindrop impacts. Again, I think I've hit on it enough. Y'all get it. We want to encourage native and beneficial plants. That's my dog. She's not a plant, but she is cute. Her name's Daisy. Yep. And so, why do we want native and beneficial plants? Because they are used to what Texas has to offer, right? Again, it goes back to that beginning. We are a state of drought that gets rain. So, it behooves us, if we want a resilient ecosystem, to have plants that are used to that, right? We want plants that can take the punches, that can handle being dry and bounce back when it gets wet. There's a discussion about, we have native plants and non-native plants and invasive and non-invasive. You can have native invasive plants like cedar. You can have non-native and non-invasive plants, and that's the reason you don't see petunias taking over despite they're being sold in every Walmart in Texas, right? So, disturbance, we will disturb the soil at some point. It is great to do it as little as possible. Sometimes you have to, right? And I've got 5 minutes left, so if I'm going through this kind of quick and you have questions, call your county agent. They're not here to defend themselves, so you know what? I'm sure they'd love the extra foot traffic. All right, so, and I think the last bit that is really important is understanding our biology. How do our plants respond and why does it matter, right? And that's just because really it goes back to like a lot of what Zach talked about when we looked at herbicide timing and use. When do our plants grow? What seasons do they grow in, right? Texas, we have 2 seasons of plants. We have warm season, which are growing now, and cool season, which will be growing in about 4 or 5 months, right? If you're trying to spray for Texas winter grass in July, it ain't gonna do anything. If you're trying to spray for Johnson grass in January, you're gonna spend a lot of money and get very frustrated because it ain't gonna do squat, right? So we need to understand what those plants are doing and how they respond to use. Because, and again, this is, if you're gonna take a picture of like a summary slide, this is the one. But this just kind of puts it all together, right? Vegetation on the surface protects your soil, preserved soils allow water and nutrients to move and be accessed, and subsurface soils allow that deep, long-term access to nutrients and water. There we are. And so when we look at practices, of course, how many of y'all have heard of Alton Leopold's 5 tools? So it's kind of famously the 5 tools that destroyed our landscape are the 5 tools we use to restore it. It's the axe, cow, plow, fire, gun, right? And these are the different ways and tools that we have as land managers to approach addressing the issues we see on the property. And I think they're pretty obvious how each of them are applied and what they are. But I think one of the biggest things, and Zach talked about it, and this is the hill I will die on. And for pretty much any property that has livestock, I feel very confident, and if you disagree, we can go have a discussion in the parking lot afterwards, but about 80 to 90% of all the issues I've seen on properties that have livestock, or whatnot, come from overutilization. Overgrazing is the cause of more problems than dang near anything else, right? Because again, when we overgraze, what are we doing? We're exposing the soil surface. We're removing diversity in plants. We're seeing less competition that might have inhibited weeds and other plants from coming up. It's allowing woody plants to come in and establish themselves in areas they might not have otherwise been able to do easily, right? And carrying capacity, and the difference between carrying capacity and stocking rate, carrying capacity is the long-term capacity, right? When we remember, look at that precipitation graph. If we looked across 5 years, multiple years, that might be okay. Yeah, if I look over the last 10 years, I could probably support, 10 cows on my property. That's my carrying capacity. My stocking rate is when in 2023 we got a bunch of rain and had some grass, and I decided I'm going to put 14 cows on it and sell those extra 4 by the end of the year. Make a little extra money, right? Both of those are important because your carrying capacity, aka your long-term stocking rate, is oftentimes directly related to the long-term resiliency of that land, right? And again, just to highlight it and highlight the challenges of overstocking, these are some pictures taken in the 1893, 1904 up in the Panhandle, right? And in 1904, this is a great quote from the Texas Almanac in 1904, right? Texas, one of the best stock ranges in this country, is so abused that today's capacity for sustaining livestock is very small in comparison with what it was 30 or even 20 years ago in 1904. If you took the date off of this end and you slapped 2024 on it, I promise you that is just as relevant today as it was then. And if we are degraded in 1904, what does that mean today? It means that grazing and overgrazing and overutilization is an issue. And it is probably the biggest issue, especially on small acreage properties, that I see across the state. And it's one where just because we have, if we don't understand how much food we're making for the mouths we're feeding, we're going to quickly have more mouths than food, and then you're going to very quickly have a lot of dirt and a lot of hay that you have to buy, and a lot of struggles with that land, right? Because grasses evolved in a grazing context. I know I'm out of time. Thank you for not throwing something at me. But again, this is like my soapbox. Because the deal is, if we have an ideal grass, and it's just growing, it puts 50% of its energy into shoots, 50% into roots. Every time we graze it, we cut it, we burn it, do something with the top, 50% of the roots stop growing for 17 days on average until those shoots come back. Because those shoots are the money makers. That's what captures the sun's energy, that's what makes it in, photosynthesizes into sugars and carbohydrates, and then lets it grow more roots, etc. Right? So every time we cut those shoots, it stops growing roots. And if we keep cutting those shoots, you're losing roots, right? And you get to a point where, how many of y'all have seen maybe someone in your neighborhood or in your community, they keep their front lawn mowed they want it like a putting green, and then as soon as the water restrictions kick in and we have a drought, how much of that grass just died, right? Because only this much leaf can only grow this much root, right? Again, we understand our biology. And I don't care if it's your lawn or your pasture. That's how grasses work. Again, I'm beating this horse to death. I feel strongly, right? We look at, here's some grasses. If we cut it down to 2 inches every week, look at how much root development you get when you cut it to 2 inches every other week versus every 4 weeks, right? Again, same deal. We have on a bunch grass, what is the root loss with the increased frequency of cutting? It is dramatic, right? And again, we talk about resiliency, we talk about adapting and managing for drought and water limited times and systems. Do you want these roots or do you want these roots, right? Because at the end of the day, you can buy and sell cows in an afternoon, right? It takes years to get grass and roots like this. So which one are you going to flex on? Which one are you going to manage the capacity for more readily, right? And when we look at the economics of stocking, more cows do not equal more money, right? When we look at this economic performance, there's a point, very light to moderate grazing, you can reach kind of a perfect mid-revenue right here. At a moderate stocking rate, you can maximize your economic efficiency. But as soon as you start pushing it past the capacity of your land to carry, you're going to start seeing a precipitous drop in your revenue, right? Because you are getting, when you get over here, you are pushing your grass beyond its ability to recover. You are pushing your forage beyond its ability to grow. And that means that now not only are you growing less forage, you are growing less forage for the next 2 to 5 years. So if you keep the same amount of cows or you try to increase the amount of cows, you're not making more money. You're actually going to be, losing a lot of it. And the grass you grow is always cheaper than the hay you buy. That's a one-liner you can take home with you. All right, again, so this is Marfa. This is that 300 pounds per acre I was telling you about that they were very proud of, right? Again, Texas has a lot of variation. This is a great pasture at Marfa. If your pasture looks like this in Kerrville, I strongly recommend you look at your carrying capacity and stocking rates. But yeah, all right. And basically for this, what do we use land for? Have a plan. Let's see. Consider your different treatments. This is what I'm going to basically handle. When we look at everything we want to do with the property, we have our goals, we have our principles, we know what we want to do, we have our tools, the axe, cow, plow, fire gun. What do we want to do? Well, I always like to think of these as ways to compare options, right? Everyone has probably seen this. You can have cheap, fast, easy, choose two, right? When we think of something like brush management, I like to sometimes think of it as an easier, hard, cheaper, expensive. You might have something like lopping cedar by hand. Might be, hard but cheap. Renting a bulldozer might be relatively middlingly challenging but expensive. Hiring contractors might be easy and it'll be very expensive, right? It's just a way to think through what our options are and then where our different priorities lie. Let's see, a four-wheeler with a sprayer and a chainsaw can do more work on a property than dang near anything else, all right? Not including the four-wheeler, I think I spent less than $300 on all this stuff. I think I got the shovel out of the trash and I just kind of welded it at an angle. Same deal with the little bakery tray that I strapped on the front. But with this, if I see something going on the property, if I see a stopped culvert, 2 minutes later I can clear it. If I see some Johnson grass or undesirable plants, I spray it, right? Those little 30-second tasks can add up to a lot of work when you're going out every weekend or every day or however that is. All right, I'm gonna skip my advice because I'm late. If you have questions, you're welcome to corner me for a little bit. Here's my email. I appreciated all of your attention. I will